You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. And now your footwear insiders, Matt Priest and Andy Polk.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Shoe In Show.
What's up?
Shoe In Show.
Party
Shoe
people.
In Show. We're the podcast where everybody goes in the footwear industry. Footwear industry. Footwear industry. Tie your shoes and put them on and let's get going. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's springtime. Flowers blooming the flowers. Woo! I could rap on for hours. Put your shoe on, lace it up. Better yet, get a slipper, get a sandal. No tie.
Bring it.
Signs of the times.
Bring it.
All right.
Signs of the times.
Well, I'm just saying, everybody's trying to, work a little less at moving around.
That's right.
I see all these scooters on the street.
Yeah, man, you got to dodge them.
Yeah, exactly right. Kelly was in Paris, and apparently the Parisians decide to ride them in the streets with the cars.
Interesting.
It seems very je ne sais quoi.
I don't know what that means, but
That's
dicey.
What it means.
It means dicey?
No, it means I don't know what it means.
Who's on first? Oui.
Très bien, Matthew Priest.
Parlez-vous français?
So our industry...
no one's going to listen to this.
No. Our industry imports 99% of all shoes sold in the U.S.
Yeah.
Which means that we are one of the most global industries in the entire world, which means that, we talk a lot about trade, but if we don't have trade, you don't have shoes.
Exactly.
That's the end. That's the end of the show right there.
Tune
Is everybody
in,
educated?
shoeinshow.com.
Congratulations, you learned something today.
Shoeinshow.com.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA.
But seriously, folks, we recently wrapped up our executive summit, our annual kind of footwear business summit for industry leaders to come together and network, chat, share best practices. And our keynote this year was none other than the former United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Froman, who is a extremely thoughtful person on trade issues, on changing societies, changing economies, has negotiated multiple agreements, including the TPP at the time under President Obama.
Yep.
But it really is kind of apolitical, and his insights that he shared at our summit were, I think it took people by surprise. The optimism he has on trade, because many people right now with our current administration being very, I don't know if it's
tread lightly.
It's just different trade.
It is totally different.
It's
different tactics. The
different
tactics. Totally
so you don't know if they're anti or they're pro, or if it's just negotiation, or if they're for bilateral, multilateral.
Yep.
No lateral.
No lateral passes.
Lateral passes in the backfield.
They hate those.
But they're throwing it down the line, so the referees don't actually know whether to throw the flag or not, whether it's a forward pass or a back pass.
When that happens.
Who gets the yards? The running back,
not the
or
Redskins.
quarterback?
I can tell you that much.
No, everybody knows that. Anyway.
So with that, the weirdest opening ever, we're going to welcome Ambassador Froman back to the program in the sense that he was at our exec summit, as Andy mentioned, and we videotaped it, and we have the audio from that, and we're now going to dump it in this episode so you can hear firsthand his insights from a trade perspective on what's going on with the current climate.
Yeah, as much as we fool around on the front of this, it's super important to understand this and unpackage it. And I don't think he does. He's one of the few people who can take a very dense technical thing and make very much sense of it. So,
yeah, and he's an executive MasterCard now. So he's on the private side. He's been on it before. He's been at other industries, at other companies, excuse me. And this is a reunion for us because on September 28th of 2016, we posted our first interview with Ambassador Froman, which at the time was like our 10th or 11th episode in Shoe and Show, and he was a trade rep then, and now he's in the private sector. So with that, Blake, roll the clip.
When I was USTR, I worked with a wide range of industries, a wide range of trade associations. And I don't get a chance to do many of these speeches anymore since I joined MasterCard, but when I got the call for this one, I was delighted because there really was no trade association more accessible, more of a partner, and that's hard to do because it means, answering the phone at 2 a.m. from someplace far away to say, what if we did this, what if we did that, if we moved this line, we moved that line, and this was a great partner of ours. So I want to thank Matt, thank the whole group here for all that you did, both during the negotiation and then standing up and having your voice heard, because I think that was very important for them to hear from you on that. Of course, that seems like eons ago, back when we were doing trade agreements like that and trying to get them through Congress. And let me just say, I'm not here to defend the administration, but I also don't think it's terribly constructive just to criticize it. And so I hope we'll have a balanced conversation about how we get to the best possible outcome from where we are now. And I'm not terribly pessimistic about that. I'm often asked, you must feel terrible about what happened with TPP. And the answer is, I don't, because one, I think particularly in trade, you have to be optimistic, otherwise you can't do those kinds of roles. And two, you have to have a long-term view of things. And the fact that the other 11 countries have moved ahead with TPP, putting in place a number of the rules, including around things like the digital economy that we negotiated, I think is positive. The fact that more countries want to join TPP as we designed it, I think that's positive. And I'm told when you look at the text of the USMCA that it's about 85% word for word TPP. And so I think that's a positive that a number of the rules that we tried to negotiate are being put in place. I will say, and I've said this several times before on the record, I do think withdrawing from TPP was probably the most significant strategic blunder in recent American history, in that I think it opened the door and opened the field to China and others filling our leadership role. But I'm hopeful that over time that we will re-engage in one form or another and be able to regain some of that role in the country. Let me spend a moment, I was going to talk about USMCA, about China, a little bit about the WTO, and a little bit about protectionism, and then happy to take questions and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. I think on USMCA, I think certainly NAFTA needed updating. We tried to update it through TPP, since both Canada and Mexico were parts of that. And I think the ultimate agreement, as I said, reflects a lot of TPP, and in many respects, or in some respects, goes beyond it. I think there's the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. In the good, I think they did get some additional market access in certain areas, like dairy in Canada. I think from the bad perspective, introducing some uncertainty around the sunset provisions, even though it was watered down. I think the idea that NAFTA could end, or there are these cliffs that have to be dealt with, creates uncertainty in the business community, which is never a good thing when you're making long-term investment decisions. And I think in the category of the ugly, I'd put the rules of origin, the auto rules of origin, only because I think it's going to take us years to really understand whether this produces more economic activity in the U.S. Or less. And there's so many other factors affecting the auto sector. I'm not sure we'll ever really know what the impact of the new rules will be, but they have certainly made things a bit more complicated. I think the question now is what happens with the USMCA? If you're Speaker Pelosi, I think you really have three options. Three or four options. One is to simply pass it as is, partner with the administration, get it done. The other is to insist on certain changes to it, although the precise changes have not been specified yet in the text. The third is to use this as an opportunity to perhaps put together a meaningful domestic package of things that would help workers and adjustment in the United States. One of the things I've been surprised about politically is after the 2016 election, I thought there'd be a lot more effort to really focus on that part of America that feels alienated by the current economic system, whether it's because of trade or technology or just the general dynamism of the economy, and make sure we were doing more from a transition assistance and training perspective to help them. And fourth, there's something called the May 10th Agreement. Back in May 10th, 2007, some House Democrats negotiated with the Bush administration an agreement of what should constitute a bipartisan consensus on trade when it comes to labor, environment, intellectual property, and the like. That's now 12 years old. It's a little bit outdated, to be frank. I think the conversations have evolved since then, and I think that Speaker Pelosi could use this as an opportunity to engage in that kind of dialogue with the administration. I am hopeful that ultimately she does move this forward and get it done, because I think we need some certainty. But it's not obvious to me that the Speaker would use what's inherently limited political capital to get a trade agreement that will be opposed by probably the majority of the Democratic caucus, although hopefully more support than usual, in order to give President Trump a win. That's the most obvious outcome for this situation. And you're all hearing more about this than I am, I'm sure, in your conversations up on the Hill, but I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about where that goes. On China, a number of the concerns that the Trump administration is going after, I think, are quite legitimate and long-standing concerns of the business community. They're going after it in a somewhat different way than we did. We took China to the WTO several times and won all those cases. I think we brought 16 cases against them during the Obama administration. We engaged with the international community to put pressure on China, particularly when it came to overcapacity in areas like steel and aluminum. And we dangled out the possibility of a bilateral investment treaty to give them the incentive to deal with certain structural issues. This administration, of course, is focused more on imposing tariffs and threatening to impose more tariffs. I have to say, and I was just in China again a couple weeks ago, it has certainly gotten the attention of the Chinese leadership. I think they are very eager to reach an accommodation with the U.S. As you all know, there's really two negotiations going on at the moment. One is what I would call the shopping list approach, how much more soybeans, liquefied natural gas, oil, et cetera, China will buy from us, and the other are over structural issues. Now, the Chinese had hoped that they could satisfy the administration with the shopping list approach. And in fact, one of my counterparts, former counterparts, about 18 months ago, said to me, "We understand how important it is for President Trump to have tweetable deliverables," which I thought was a fantastic phrase. And he said, "We're perfectly prepared to give him tweetable deliverables. We just want to know what the price is." I think, again, to the administration's credit, they appear not to be willing to be satisfied by the shopping list approach and are continuing to go after the more fundamental structural issues. The challenge there is that those issues are much more difficult to go after. I think the good news is there is some precedent. And if you look at the bilateral investment treaty, which was about 90% done when we left office, it dealt with forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, enforcement, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, all the things that are currently being discussed. And my hope is that the administration will pocket whatever we were able to get and try and get more. If from the press that I read, the current issue really seems to be more over how to enforce the agreement once it's been reached. And there's a challenge, because the bilateral investment treaty was going to be enforced by traditional kind of WTO-like state-to-state dispute settlement, where you have international arbitration, each country nominates an arbitrator, you agree on a third, and you resolve your disputes like that. And also by something called investor-state dispute settlement, where private companies could bring the Chinese government to neutral international arbitration. This administration doesn't like either one of those kinds of enforcement. They stripped NAFTA of most of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, and they've been opposed to a lot of what the WTO has done in terms of state-to-state dispute settlement. And that's why they're focused now on maintaining tariffs on China and having the right to impose tariffs on China unilaterally and trying to constrain China's ability to retaliate going forward. I don't know whether China will agree to that. That would be a rather remarkable step if they were able to achieve that we could impose tariffs unilaterally on China and China would have no right to retaliate. But that is what the administration is currently trying to negotiate, and we will see what happens there. I think if we look back, really back to 1979, when we first opened up relations with China, the whole theory had been that if we engage with China, they will become more like us over time. They'll become more westernized, they'll adopt international standards, they'll play a more responsible role as a stakeholder in the international community. And what we saw instead is that China is incredibly disciplined about pursuing its self-interest, relatively narrowly defined, and paying as little as possible for the broader system in terms of compromises and otherwise that they've benefited from. What's interesting now is that instead of China becoming more like the US, we're becoming Chinese. And if you think about the America First strategy, it's a lot about we're going to pursue our narrow national interests first and pay as little as possible in terms of compromise for the health of the multilateral system. And I think the question is, can the world absorb and tolerate two Chinas, one there and one here? And I think the jury is very much out on that. And we see that playing out right now in the whole issue around the multilateral trading system and the World Trade Organization. The WTO really has three functions. One is to negotiate trade liberalizing agreements. The second is to monitor countries' trade policies, and countries are supposed to report on their subsidies, and they review each other's trade practices every couple of years. And the third is as a dispute settlement body. The first function, as a negotiating body, basically ground to a halt with the Doha round, which kind of failed in 2008, and it became clear over the course of the Obama administration. We made it clear to people that there was no way we were going to achieve those kinds of big multilateral comprehensive agreements on the basis of the Doha approach. And that's why we instead pushed various smaller plurilateral agreements or parts of an overall agreement, like the trade facilitation agreement. So the function of the WTO as a major multilateral comprehensive negotiating organization is certainly under stress. The second part, where countries are supposed to report their trade practices and other countries are supposed to evaluate them, that too has been under stress because countries have simply ignored it. So China has refused to notify the WTO of its subsidy programs, and instead the US has taken on itself the obligation of reporting on China's subsidy programs. And so that part of the organization has been somewhat put under stress. Now, but we always said, even though those two parts were under stress, we said, well, at least we have dispute settlement. And that's sort of the jewel in the crown of the WTO, being able to go to an institution and have binding and enforceable dispute settlement procedures. Those procedures are not perfect by any means. They take way too long to reach resolution. Occasionally, the arbitrators go beyond their mandate and try to make up law that doesn't exist, and when we objected to that during the Obama administration. The Trump administration has taken that to a whole new level, as you all know, and has blocked the appointment of any new appellate body judges until the organization agrees to its reform proposals. And I personally think a number of its reform proposals have merit, and I do hope the other countries take them seriously and look at how to improve and streamline the dispute settlement body, and so that we can get new arbitrators appointed. Because if we don't, by the end of this year, there will not be enough people on the arbitration board, on the appellate body, to appoint a new arbitration panel, meaning there won't be any ability to appeal a decision by the WTO, and it means that there won't be any international dispute settlement. And this administration is comfortable with that. If you talk to Ambassador Lighthizer, he will talk in quite nostalgic terms about the pre-WTO era, the era in which the U.S. was able to sort of throw its weight around by the size of its market and get other countries to bend to its will. I personally think there's a little bit of a revisionist history there, because the U.S. was very frustrated that other countries could avoid binding dispute settlement back then. That's what led to the WTO being created in the Uruguay round negotiations in the 1990s themselves. But the main thing that's changed since the 1990s is that we are still the largest economy in the world, but we're not the only large economy. And the fact that China is obviously a very important player, that the EU increasingly has gotten its act together on trade, means that we don't quite have the same ability to act unilaterally, I think, as we used to. And that brings me to the last topic, which is around protectionism. We have 301 against China, where we imposed sanctions on about $250 billion of $200 billion of their exports. We have the 232 national security cases, where we impose sanctions on steel and aluminum exports from around the world, including from some of our closest allies, and where we're now considering imposing sanctions on, or imposing tariffs on auto imports. This was the national security exception was always intended to be a very narrow exception. And the traditional position of the U.S. had been to not use it because we knew that if we used it, other countries would abuse it. And, I can make the argument, I don't necessarily agree with it, I can make the argument of why steel and aluminum imports threaten our national security, not because they come from Germany or Canada, who are obviously close allies of ours, but because we need a strong steel and aluminum sector here in case there is any war in the future. And if we don't have a strong domestic sector, you don't know whether you can produce the planes and the tanks and all the other equipment that you need to produce under a national security situation. I don't think that's a winning argument, by the way, but at least I think one can make the argument. I think it's a little harder when you get to autos. We do have a robust auto sector here. We have a lot of capacity here. The auto companies have been doing quite well over the last several years, so they're not on their back in the same way that the steel industry has felt over time because of imports. And it's hard to imagine that we would need our auto companies in a national security situation in quite the same way going forward. But I think the real issue is when we start imposing tariffs on countries, there are three categories of costs. There's the direct costs, simply it being more expensive for people to buy the imported products, raising the cost of living for American families, or raising the cost of inputs into American manufacturing that then makes our companies less competitive. There's the cost of retaliation, as we have seen, particularly around agriculture, where now it is more difficult for our farmers and ranchers to get access to markets in Europe, in Japan, in China, because those countries have retaliated against our tariffs. And then there's a third category of risk, which is the risk of imitation, that where other countries look at the U.S. We've always had the moral high ground to hold other countries to account for violating their international obligations. When we start violating our international obligations, it opens a Pandora's box, and other countries are able to basically have a free rein to do whatever they want. And we already see that in certain ways where countries are saying, well, if the U.S. views autos as a national security threat, we view agricultural imports as a national security threat. Food security is a national security issue. And you can see countries beginning to selectively apply their international obligations now that the U.S. has opened the door to that. The other thing that I would say, and this came up a little bit during the break, about tariffs, is that tariffs are very easy to put on and very hard to take off. We have a 25% tariff on imported pickup trucks because of the chicken war of 1963 with the European Union. The Europeans kept out our chicken. We retaliated with a 25% tariff against Volkswagen vans. And the industry got used to it. And by the way, we have a very profitable pickup industry in the United States. But as I know from our TPP and TTIP negotiations, to negotiate the elimination of that tariff is exceedingly difficult. In TPP, we agreed to eliminate it, but only after 30 years, which was the longest phase out of any tariff in any trade agreement ever negotiated in history by anybody. That's just an indication. And you, of course, face that in your own sector where you have some peak tariffs on imports. I know from our TPP negotiations, again, that there is room, because we were able to bring the importers as well as the domestic footwear producers to the table and have them both endorse TPP at the end of the day. There is room for lowering those tariffs, but it's exceedingly difficult to do. Imagine how difficult it will be if the Trump administration wants to lift the tariffs on steel. The steel workers, the steel companies who are now profitable for the first time in several years, who are seeing capacity utilization go up, I think they will put up a pretty big hue and cry and become much more difficult. Having said all that, let me end on an optimistic note. It starts with a story and then a projection. The story is when I was talking to President Obama about becoming trade representative, I went in and sitting in the Oval Office and I said, I want to negotiate this TPP, I want to do TTIP, I want to do this, I want to do that. And he said, that's great, but I also think you should work on rebuilding the bipartisan consensus on trade. And I went back near the end of the administration, say goodbye, and I said, well, Republicans hate trade, Democrats hate trade, mission accomplished. Perhaps you should have given me a little more guidance about what kind of bipartisan consensus you were looking for. I say that because I have a contrarian view, and I've been saying this publicly since day one of the Trump administration, and it is beginning to come true. My contrarian view is, we're going to learn a lot from this administration about trade. For example, if you take the USMCA, if you take the worst trade agreement in history, which is NAFTA, according to the president, and then you layer on top of it the most calamitous trade agreement in history, which was TPP, now you have a beautiful agreement. And the president will go out and advocate for USMCA as a big, beautiful, huge agreement, by definition, and he's a wonderful salesman. And his base of support fundamentally trusts him. They believe he understands them, that he respects them, and that he has their back even when he does things that may not be in their economic interest. And I'm optimistic that he will actually be able to get a significant portion of his base to support USMCA, and that he will be able to help rebuild the consensus on trade in the United States. I think at the end of the day, President Trump may be the greatest globalist ever. That's my contrarian view. You heard it here first. What? I welcome your questions.
I got a question. Where did that come from?
Well, no, it's interesting because the question was ultimately the Republican Party's given away the mantle on being pro-trade. The Democrats aren't necessarily picking that up. Some Democrats are. So who's going to carry it? Who's going to continue to talk about the importance of trade liberalization and the movement of goods without barriers? And I think his point is not off in the sense that Trump has taken us down a road to see all the negative impacts that anti-globalization can have, that because of that, he will create a new movement towards freer and fairer trade. So
it's a great, I like it.
Yeah, I like
Makes
it too.
You think about it, right?
Yep, totally.
All right, folks, this is Shoe and Show. We cover all things footwear. Today you heard a little bit of insight on trade, and as we pointed out at the beginning of the show, trade drives our industry, so hugely important topic and issue. If you have ideas for shows that we should do, topics, speakers that we should have on, please drop us a line. We're at shoeandshow.com. We are the Footwear Industries Podcast. We want to hear from you. If you yourself want to be a guest, let us know. We're happy to have you on and grill you mercilessly, just like Chris Matthews does on It's Hardball. Right, Matt? Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. All right, folks. Until next time, thanks so much for tuning in. Shoe-In is out.
Shoe-In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.